Hello, I'm Jonasz Rawiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. As always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. Georgia's government says it is avoiding war with Russia. Moscow calls Georgia's government friendly. But they have occupied its land, flooded its markets, and now they want back in diplomatically. This isn't a partnership. It's an illusion built on fear, trade, and silence. When is a partnership not a partnership? When one side sends tanks and the other sends tourists. Welcome to the surreal state of Georgia-Russia relations in 2025. Here is a look at our latest report to allow you to find out more about this intriguing scenario.
Russia's imperial appetite did not come to light in February 2022 or during the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. One of the most telling signs of what Moscow had in store for its neighbours could be seen in 2008 when Russian forces invaded Georgia. Georgian opposition to this unwarranted attack is one of the events which shaped modern Georgian nationhood, a former Soviet republic that refused to be drawn back into the so-called Russian world. What Georgians had to say about Russia all those years ago, in hindsight, seems like a hefty dose of real-life foreshadowing.
It is painful, as this situation could have been avoided, provided the world had been more vigilant with Russia, and then we could have saved a lot of human lives.
As a result of the 2008 war, Russia occupies some 20% of Georgian territory, including the breakaway regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Many ethnic Georgian villages were destroyed and thousands were displaced in the wake of this takeover. This was the first time in years that Russia had dared to directly attack an independent country. Despite international condemnation, however, the measures undertaken by the West in response were nowhere near as severe as can be seen today. The memory of this conflict continues to live among Georgians. It is one of, if not the most important reason, why Georgian society is so pro-Western. And despite the social mood and national memory, it seems that the Georgian government itself is inclined to forget and move closer to the Russians.
And now we're zoning in on the East-splaining portion of our show. The Georgian Dream is often accused by Western observers and many pro-European Georgians of being pro-Russian. Although the party itself officially denies these claims, since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it has been pivoting towards Moscow.
The issue of the Georgian Dream's pro-Russian approach is complex, as officially no one from the party's leadership has been going around singing Vladimir Putin's praises. It is the party's actions, however, that observers say give it a pro-Russian position. Many policies enacted by the Georgian government seem to be straight out of Russia's playbook. From the so-called foreign agents law to brutal police crackdowns against peaceful protests, which were pro-European and anti-Russian. The Georgian Dream has also terminated the parliament mandates of opposition MPs and pushed through its own candidate for president. Simultaneously, however, despite Western condemnation, the country's leadership has continued to spin a bizarre narrative about wanting to continue Georgia's EU accession. Another paradoxical approach is the one that Georgia has taken towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Although Georgia officially condemned the invasion, it refused to send military aid to Ukraine and did not join Western sanctions against Moscow. In its rhetoric, the Georgian Dream has been doing little in terms of cozying up to the Russians, but in its case, actions have been speaking far louder than words.
And now we're zooming in on Tbilisi to examine the issue in greater detail. Officially, Georgia and Russia have no diplomatic ties. They haven't since 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia and occupied 20% of its territory. That occupation continues today. But unofficially, there is a lot going on. Flights have resumed. Visas are gone. Trade is up. Russia calls Georgia friendly. But that friendliness ends with the Georgian public. According to recent polling, 69% of Georgians view Russia as an enemy. That's more than 2/3 of the country. They know what happened in 2008. They see what's happening in Ukraine now, and they are not buying what the ruling Georgian Dream Party is trying to sell them. And that is because the Georgian government is pursuing damage control disguised as pragmatism. They have passed laws inspired directly by the Kremlin, including a notorious foreign agents bill designed to crush NGOs and silence dissent. Even Putin himself has actually praised it. Meanwhile, Georgian Dream tells voters that being friendly to Moscow might lead to something big, like like regaining control of occupied Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Russia is demanding formal recognition of the current boundaries, and here is the problem. Even Moscow doesn't treat the Georgian government like a partner, more like a client state expected to follow orders but rewarded only with smiles and photo ops. Economic dependence is growing. Georgian Dream likes to brag about booming trade and record tourist numbers from Russia. In 2024 alone, 1.9 million Russians visited Georgia. But if we're talking numbers, the average EU tourist spends $1,300. The average Russian tourist just $700. That's not an economic windfall, that is discount occupation. And while Georgian Dream touts the return of friendly ties, Georgia is quietly helping Moscow circumvent sanctions. Somehow, 99,000 tons of Georgian oil made it to Spain last year, despite Georgia not having any oil. A record number of yachts were also exported from Georgia, because the government's real goal isn't to defend sovereignty, it's to hold on to power. Their propaganda paints Russia as both the enemy and the savior. They say only they can stop Russian invasion, but they also mimic Russia's laws, echo Russia's talking points, and avoid any criticism of the Kremlin. Georgia is still technically at war with Russia. No peace treaty has ever been signed, and no amount of flights, tourists, or talking points will change that. The Georgian people know the truth. The question is, how long until their government actually remembers it? And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Grigoriu Lukhidze, Associate Professor at the Caucasus University. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello.
So let's talk about this paradox with diplomatic ties between Georgia and Russia, or rather the lack thereof. To the average person on the street, the fact that the Georgian Dream Party, which is often referred to as pro-Russian, at the same time doesn't actually want to have diplomatic ties with Russia, may seem difficult to understand. So can you explain it briefly in a way that perhaps clarifies the issue, which otherwise might remain a bit obscure to some?
The situation is far more complicated because the Georgian Dream understands very well that it would be crossing of the red line if the ruling party of Georgia will reestablish bilateral diplomatic relations with Moscow, because it will be a quite dangerous political decision amid extreme unpopularity of the Russian Federation among Georgians. That's why we might see deepening economic and even subtly political relations between the Kremlin and the government of Georgia, but it does not automatically mean that it will lead in the near future to the restoration of bilateral diplomatic relations.
But at the same time, this does not invalidate the point that Georgian Dream is very much a party that conducts an overall, what we should refer to as a pro-Russian policy, right? I mean, including the fact that the negotiations with the European Union have been, well, suspended, derailed, effectively, by what they did.
Because it is much worse, I would say, than to reestablish diplomatic relations with Russia, because in fact the ruling team unfortunately acts as not direct but indirect ally of Moscow in this region, and by deteriorating relations with strategic partners, including the European Union and other member states, it means that the consequences might be devastating in the medium and long run for this country, because let's put aside the sentiments and emotions, but when you stay alone with the country like Russia, especially in the complicated geopolitical region like the South Caucasus, it means that the ability to keep moving towards more independence or more independent foreign policy is extremely limited because Moscow is increasing its leverage, its pressure over Georgia, and we can monitor it in terms of the traces of Moscow in the fields like economy, energy sector, the influx of Russians who come to Georgia and have no further intention to leave this country, and of course, political aspect of this dimension, which does not predict anything good in the medium and long run for Georgia.
So all of this is in a way the consequence of what happened in 2008. How strong are these memories, the memories of the Russian invasion within Georgian society today? And what is their impact on the decision-making of ordinary Georgians as they go to the polls, as they ponder what the country should do next? And as they make all these crucial choices, which later on have an impact on the governance of the country?
Well, as I have mentioned, the Georgian Dream does not operate as an openly pro-Russian party, but in fact its actions are in line with the interests of Moscow. But not all Georgians understand that, especially amid the weakening opposition, which is extremely inefficient in terms of strategic communication and provision of political solutions from this complicated situation. The Georgian Dream perfectly understands this momentum, is benefiting from it. And apart from that, they quite well evaluate the social moods towards Moscow. The vast majority of Georgians, I would say, that are very antagonistically positioned towards the Russian Federation. They have not forgotten about the invasion of 2008. And it means that no political party right now is able to make and issue pro-Russian statements. And in these political shadows, the only solution is to act subtly. And once again, I repeat that not all Georgians have a proper political culture and knowledge to understand these actions. Meanwhile, the state propaganda works quite effectively. It is mainly oriented on the demonization of already weakened political opponents. The actions of the European Union, which we have to admit that are not ideal and far from the ideal condition, because we see that the European Union is fragmented in terms of many foreign political decisions, that the member states have different positions in terms of Georgia. There are some rebellious member states like Hungary, Slovakia, Italy, and there is no consensus right now in the EU. Apart from that, we have to take into the consideration the fact that Washington is not interested in this region, and it was almost openly stated by the White House administration, because their decreased interest towards Georgia can be explained by the worsening situation in Russo-Ukrainian war, aggressive actions of China. And in this political reality, the topic of Georgia is from the category of less interest. But unfortunately, many Georgians
do you think it's a problem with the region, though? I want to ask a quick question. Do you think this is about the region, or is it simply that Georgia has been pushed back on the list of priorities? Because we're actually having a meeting with leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia in the US in order to broker a possible peace deal. That would indicate that there is an interest in the region in general.
Yes, the interest still exists, but it does not mean that the level of interest is as high as it was, for example, before the war. And the Georgian Dream understands this reality and implements authoritarian policy, because I would say that nobody is ready to take drastic actions to punish the Georgian Dream, and we have already seen it because they're constantly testing the red lines, how far they can go. And by applying these salami tactics in terms of the establishment of authoritarian regime in Georgia, at the same time, they analyzed the reactions from the West. And until now, only several countries were harsh in terms of political assessments and criticism towards the Georgian government. That's why all these issues are interconnected. Georgia is a country which is situated quite far from the European Union. It does not share the common border with the European Union member state. And apart from that, the ability of the West right now to react to such kind of regional challenges is I would say, reduced due to the more challenging threats like Russo-Ukrainian war, artificially orchestrated crisis on the Polish-Belarus border, internal divisions, the uncertainty in terms of the relations between Brussels and Washington, and of course, sophisticated undermining actions of the Russian Federation.
Wouldn't you say that this is an indictment of the ability of the West to respond to crises which fall short of a full-blown war or anything like that? And even then, I mean, 2008, it was a war, and the response was underwhelming. The Obama administration moved on to a reset with the Russian Federation shortly thereafter. So, again, like what you're saying right now is that there is no consensus, there is no strategy regarding what to do. And the Georgian Dream Party has managed to become this sort of slightly amorphous entity that positions itself as slightly conservative, but then again slightly pro-European, but then again also pretending to defend Georgia against a possible spillover of the war in Ukraine. So wouldn't that essentially point towards one particular problem, that if there is no strategy to respond, then situations like that will occur, not just in Georgia, but other places too, perhaps?
Exactly. Jonas, you have very correctly assessed the current situation, the tragedy of the countries like Georgia, who are in a different geopolitical dimension in the area, far from the European Union, far from the Western states. And I remind you that the neighbors of Georgia are Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Russia. And in this region, the growing influence of authoritarian countries like Iran, like China, like Russia can be traced, and these influences are being increased on a daily basis. And amid this uncertainty and the issues that I have already mentioned, we live in this geopolitical situation. And unfortunately, the Georgian government already made its choice to backslide in terms of democracy, because it is right now permitted, not officially, but unofficially, because there will be no, I would say, immediate consequences. They understand that. And of course, I know them quite well, that their main task is to maintain power. And right now, their current pro-Russianism is not related to their pro-Russian sentiments, but just they analyzed the situation and made the conclusion that to maintain and keep the power, for them in their best interest is to launch relations with the authoritarian countries rather than the Western democracies. And for them, the main task right now is to consolidate their power and limit the operational field for political opposition.
Grigory Luchize was our guest today here on the Eastern Express. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Although the war in Ukraine has been raging for more than 3 years, The US and Europe have not ceased all trade with the Russians. Deals between the West and Russia still amount to billions, despite various sanctions that were imposed along the line.
Imports from Russia to the EU have dropped significantly since the start of the Russian invasion, by 86% between the first quarter of 2022 and the first quarter of 2025, according to Eurostat. Nonetheless, there are still areas in which the two sides have been trading. The EU is still purchasing resources such as fertilizer, oil and steel from the Russians. While recent sanctions on oil delivered via ships have reduced the import of Russian oil, these purchases were still worth more than €1 billion in the first quarter of 2025. When it comes to fertilizer, on the other hand, Russia remains the EU's largest exporter as of 2025, with only a minimal decrease since 2022. Moscow hasn't been idle when it comes to these drops, however, and has been boosting trade with other partners such as India and China, despite warnings about potential tariff increases by the United States against India in particular.
Belarusian authorities say that they will push for criminal charges against Belarusians who protest the government abroad. These cases will lead to trials in absentia and may even result in property seizures.
It seems that for the Minsk regime, forcing people out of the country is not nearly enough of a punishment. Belarusian authorities say that they have identified over 200 individuals who took part in celebrations of Belarus's 1918 Independence Day abroad. Minsk says that these events were directed by allegedly extremist and terrorist organizations. These decisions by the Lukashenko regime do not seem to be discouraging Belarusians abroad from protesting, however, as thousands intend to take part in events commemorating the 5th anniversary of the 2020 protests, which will be held in Warsaw later this month. According to estimates, some 600,000 Belarusians have been forced to leave their home country due to the political and social repression imposed by the Lukashenko regime.
Turkmenistan is facing a serious problem when it comes to its draconian reproductive laws. The country's authoritarian leadership is forcing women to have babies in an effort to combat population decline.
Turkmenistan's population growth rate has been stagnating. It fell to its lowest level in 2023, 1.84%, a significant drop compared to the 2.29% growth rate from a decade ago. The Turkmenistani government has undertaken a very unorthodox approach to solve what it sees as a problem, and over the years it has introduced several policies meant to force women to have babies. Abortion laws in the country have been tightened, and abortion is now only legal up to the 5th week of pregnancy, the lowest in the world. Less than a half of the country's women use contraceptives, and they are heavily discouraged from doing so. Socially, women across Turkmenistan have limited access to education and far fewer job opportunities than men. Most of them have been left on the economic margins of Turkmenistani society.
And that's all for now. Thank you for watching, and please stay with us here on TVP World.